Hi, this is Professor Apfel again. I'm back with Professor Buxbaum, who, as you may know, is teaching the other section of the Finance of Higher Education. We are going to debrief a little bit about Tony Jiga's interview, which was, I thought, very interesting. He's a very learned guy. A couple of different things jumped out at I think, the both of us that would like to talk about. Where he started and ran through the entire interview was this question of judgment, not judgment like a judge judging, but the use of estimates, the uncertainty of things. How do you size it up? Howard, by the way, Professor Buxbaum, is currently Vice President for
Finance Administration at Bloomfield College in New Jersey.
So he's in the thick of it as well as teaching the course. So how do you, as a working professional in this area, how do you size this question of judgment calls and estimates out?
Jeff, I also thought that was a very interesting aspect that Tony brought up in his responses to your questions. I've been in higher education for about 30 years, and most of that time I've been involved in budgeting in some role, either supervising the budgeting function or being the budget director or so forth and so on, or doing financial planning. So I've been involved in that a lot. And my thought on this, my initial thought is that it requires a tremendous amount of experience of going through various budget cycles to really fine-tune your estimating skills. It's not something where there's a formula that you can go to page 995, like figuring out a net present value. It's something that you have to have a lot of experience with. And as Tony divided the budget between revenue and expense, I think by far the most difficult thing to project is the revenue side. Even in a small institution like Bloomfield College with 2,000 students, we have various populations. We might have adult students, we might have first-time students, we might have online students. We have students who drop out and come back. So we have to have, we do research in terms of the characteristics of those. When we make an offer to a new student, and we try to bring in, for example, 450 new students to our school every year, we might have to make an offer of 600 or 700 students to have 450 students come. And then we may have 475 people deposit, but then there's what we call a melt, as Tony referred to. So not all those people are going to come. So we study over the course of even 3 to 5 years the characteristics of different subsegments, whether it's a transfer student or a new student or students who are returning to the college, so forth and so on. And we develop factors, and we try to see how those factors are changing. And we develop relatively complicated models, but there is always the professional judgment element the trends seem to be changed. And we often say we can't go with the 5-year trend or the 3-year trend. Things seem to be different. You have to understand who the competition is and what they're doing and how we interact with them. We look at overlaps and we see how we compare with our competition, and we study those changes. So there's a lot to it of really developing a repertoire of skills and knowledge base to do estimating. The expense side is somewhat easier. Similar to what Tony talked about, we also look at expenses on, for us, really twice a year. We're relatively small. We don't really have the people power to do it quarterly, but we do a big mid-year review, and we do an analysis of significant variances. And that helps us really put together the budget for the following year. But expenses are somewhat more predictable if you have 60 or 65% of your budget tied up in salaries and benefits, and we know how many people we have on the payroll. That is relatively easy to predict. But some things are not easy to predict. Unanticipated expenses or inflation or things, so forth and so on. And again, that's where the contingency comes in.
The other thing that Tony talked about, which I thought was so interesting, is in the use of reserves, where he said, sometimes you set aside a public one, sometimes you set aside one that nobody knows about, and sometimes you don't even have a pot of money. You're just conservative in your revenue estimates. So what happens is anybody that can control money, nobody wants to get in trouble. So that everybody that has a say over it, whether it's a unit or in the central office, is going to be careful. If they're doing their job well, they're going to be careful. I remember when I worked at OMB in the city when Tony was there, and I remember the first time when I was new, I had control at a young age of a $250 million community development block grant budget, And I went to see the budget director, and he wanted to know how much flexibility was in the budget. And I estimated it as around 20 million that could be moved around or reprogrammed if we needed to do something to help the overall budget. And he said to me something like, well, if it's 20, then it's really 40, right? And I didn't know what he meant. What he meant was he's used to people coming in and saying something, and then they, even from him.
Right.
And his job was to poke me to see whether, and I said, no, it's 20. He said, wait a second, are you new here? If you tell me 20, it's really 40. Because he then recognized that everybody is sort of playing that game. And so you have, as Tony said, you can have a little of that is fine because it gives everybody the flexibility they need, but then how do you control that and how do you manage that from a central perspective to make sure it doesn't get too bloated so that you have a dynamic relationship as people are all gaming one another to some extent?
But I think that's a good point, and I think my position on all this has evolved over the years. When I first started in higher education about 30 years ago, I was the budget director and I reported to a VP for finance, and he literally in the first week said, you got to have contingencies because people will try to aggressively spend and you don't know what's going to happen and so forth and so on. And his position was that was all kind of opaque. And I kind of accepted that for a number of years, and my position has really evolved to a position of total transparency. In other words, in my current position, we have a stated contingency that we negotiate around. The president always wants a lower contingency, and the finance people myself included, want a slightly higher number. But we also, as Tony said, we are very public in comparing our fundraising goals and enrollment goals with the budget. And so we will say, we know that enrollment management is trying to bring in 450 new students. We're budgeting 425. And it's not
known by everybody then.
What?
It's known by everybody. So
it's known by, it's not in the published document that we present to the board. We don't necessarily get into that level of detail, but in the cabinet minutes, people know how conservative we've been because people will ultimately get suspicious. If you continue to have surpluses and you were saying this is the number and the number is really some number, it does create a level of suspicion.
But there's an interesting dynamic there because it seems to me if you use that transparency to build trust, then you come out ahead. But if somehow or other you're not trusted enough and you're transparent, that's I think one of the reasons why people don't like to be transparent. They feel that they'll be taken advantage of. And if you're building off of a system that doesn't have a lot of trust in it, and you get transparent too soon, people probably will take advantage of you. But it sounds good. It sounds as though if you're willing to say your position has evolved to transparency, it must also be the case that I'd like to think, or maybe you have, used that transparency to build sufficient trust at cabinet or among the constituencies to say, okay, I see he was conservative here with what he did, and that's probably good that he was conservative because we all need a rainy day fund.
That's right. And I think that what is true, and I can't speak to a large institution like NYU, although I have worked in a large institution, but I think in smaller, more intimate settings, if the finance officer has to be very willing to have ongoing dialogues with the other areas, where opportunities may come up and you can't always be the no person. So you have to be willing to be somewhat flexible. So if the student affairs person says, we're having a problem with psychological services and we're just not being able to meet the number of people, the number of visits, and you said we'd like to bring in someone on a very part-time basis to handle the overload, you have to be at least sensitive to those things that come up during the year. So I think it then becomes the collegiality aspect and the trust aspect where the finance sector has to be and should be somewhat responsive to things that come up or kind of understanding other needs because it's very easy to be focused solely on the numbers and not necessarily be responsive to students or people who are running the program.
That raises another interesting issue about culture, I guess, that people think of these things as almost like mechanics. How do the mechanics of it work? But as Tony was quick to point out correctly, that you don't think of a budget, you can think of a budget as a mechanical plan for spending money over 1 year, where it inhabits a much broader universe of strategy, long-term thinking, but it also inhabits a cultural. It's going to partake of whatever the culture is. A large place is, they may have their own issues or transparency or trust, but, because I worked at a small place too, and I think I definitely agree with you that in a small place, if you can use the budget to create community, or if there's a culture of trust and community because it's a small place where people know one another and dialogues are possible, then it's really wisdom, I think, to move the budget into that space, to have it be part of that culture and support a collegial discussion-based culture rather than a rule-based culture. I don't know if you could take your kind of Quaker approach to budgeting, where people sort of, you know the student affairs people, they know you're transparent about the reserves and the contingencies that are there. If you move that to a Harvard, or you move it to a University of Michigan or whatever with multiple campuses, it may not work. You may need many more rules in order to get by.
I think that's true, but I think what you and Tony were alluding to with responsibility-centered management is important to consider just for another minute, and that is part of RCM is to get the decision to a unit that's small enough where we could have those conversations. So, for example, I worked in a health sciences university, and I worked in the central administration, and I also worked in one of the medical schools. Even though the medical school was relatively large in the sense that even, the medical school itself had a $100 million budget in the context of a $1 billion some odd budget for a large research university, the medical school was small enough, and the dean had the right personality since he had been on the faculty before he became the dean. The medical school was small enough that given the decentralized environment, the dean and the school became the place to have that conversation as opposed to the college.
Yeah.
Or perhaps even within a medical school, there was decentralized decision-making into the department. So for example, you might have 30 faculty members in the Department of Surgery, perhaps with a $25 or $30 million budget. So even there, the head of that department then was a subunit where he or she could have those conversations with his faculty in terms of how they're designing programs or how they're running research or how they're running. Right. So I think part of it is to really understand and to give enough authority at various units. When you look at highly centralized public universities, sometimes we don't see that.
Well, with the trust then once you have a rule that says, I'm going to impose a 10% tax on your revenues or whatever, and you get to keep the balance, that's one way of building trust. In other words, I'm just going to let you make the decisions you need to make. We actually need to wrap up. More to come on this. I know that RCM is probably going to be a bigger discussion in my class anyway, so we'll be down this road a little bit further.
No, I think it's a fascinating topic, Jeff.
Well, glad we had a chance to kick around Tony's discussion. I thought it was very useful.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
All right.